The room was buzzing with laughter, but it wasn't the kind that warms the soul. It was sharp, mocking, and cruel. At the center of it all stood a boy, 16 years old, tall but awkward, his eyes darting nervously as his hands moved in broken, hesitant signs. His name was Daniel. He was the son of Richard Harlow, one of the richest men in the city. And in that glittering restaurant filled with wealthy patrons, no one was laughing at the billionaire. They were laughing at his deaf son. Daniel's hands trembled as he tried to sign something, desperate to communicate. But his movements were clumsy and the cruel laughter grew louder. A group of teenagers at a nearby table pointed and mimicked his gestures, exaggerating them like a cruel parody. The adults chuckled too, some shaking their heads, others whispering how tragic it was that a man with everything could have a son so broken. Richard sat frozen, his jaw tight, his face pale with fury and shame. For all his money and power, in that moment he felt powerless. He had fought boardrooms, investors, politicians, but he couldn't fight the stinging reality of seeing his only child humiliated in front of strangers. And then, just as Daniel lowered his head, ready to flee, a voice cut through the laughter. Enough. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, firm, and carried a weight that silenced the room. It was Emma, a young waitress no one had paid much attention to all evening. She was balancing plates just moments before, blending into the background as staff are expected to. But now she set the tray down and stepped forward, her eyes blazing with quiet courage. She walked right up to Daniel and with a gentle smile she began signing. Daniel froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. Someone understood him. Someone cared enough to try. Emma's hands moved gracefully, confidently. You're doing great. Don't let them take your voice away. She signed, her fingers fluid in motion. Daniel's lips curled into the first real smile he'd shown all evening. He signed back slowly.
You know sign. Emma nodded. Yes.
My younger brother is deaf. You're not alone. The room, once filled with laughter, had gone utterly silent. People stared, ashamed and stunned, as Emma held her ground. Then she turned to the crowd. Do you hear yourselves? She said aloud. You laugh at what you don't understand. This boy is smarter and braver than any of you, because he fights every single day to be heard in a world that refuses to listen. No one spoke. The teenagers who had mocked Daniel shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older man coughed and looked down at his plate. Richard rose slowly, his chest heavy with emotion. For once, the billionaire was not the most powerful person in the room. That power belonged to a waitress who had dared to speak, when everyone else stayed silent. From that night, everything began to change. Richard reached out to Emma afterward, thanking her with a voice that cracked despite his usual confidence. You have no idea what you just did for my son, he said. But Emma only smiled. I didn't do it for you, sir. I did it for him. He deserves to be seen, not pitied, and he deserves respect. Daniel, standing nearby, nodded vigorously, his eyes shining. Over the weeks that followed, Richard invited Emma to spend time with Daniel as a tutor and friend. She taught him new ways to express himself, encouraging him to sign boldly, to embrace who he was instead of shrinking away. She introduced him to a community of deaf students, helping him find people who shared his struggles and dreams. But the road wasn't easy. Daniel carried years of scars from being misunderstood. At school, teachers assumed he was slow because he struggled with speech. Classmates excluded him from games and conversations. Even at home, Richard, though he loved his son, often buried himself in work, convincing himself that money could somehow protect Daniel from pain. There were days Daniel snapped, throwing his books across the room, signing angrily that it was pointless to try. There were nights Richard lay awake, guilt eating at him, wondering if he had failed as a father. And through it all, Emma stayed. She reminded Daniel that his worth wasn't tied to the cruel opinions of strangers. She reminded Richard that love wasn't about fixing his son, but standing beside him. The real turning point came months later, at a charity gala Richard was hosting. The same kind of glittering event where Daniel used to hide in the shadows, dreading the stares. But this time was different. Emma had helped Daniel prepare a short speech in sign language, with an interpreter beside him. Richard nervously watched from the sidelines, praying his son wouldn't lose his courage. Daniel stepped onto the stage, his hands shaking. The crowd murmured. Some remembered the night at the restaurant. Others had no idea what to expect. And then Daniel began to sign. Hello, my name is Daniel. Some of you may know my father. He has money, power, and success. But what I want you to know is that none of those things matter as much as kindness. The interpreter's voice echoed his words across the hall. The audience leaned in, captivated. For years, people laughed at me. They called me broken. They saw my silence as weakness. But thanks to someone who stood up for me, I realized silence can be powerful too. Tonight, I want to remind you. Every person has a voice, even if it doesn't sound the way you expect. By the time Daniel finished, the room was on its feet, thunderous applause echoing like never before. Richard's eyes brimmed with tears. He had never been prouder. And Emma, standing at the back, smiled quietly. She hadn't just defended a boy in a restaurant. She had helped change the way people saw him, and maybe the way the world saw others like him.